Hey there, and welcome to this episode of Speaking of. Today we're speaking of really the death penalty, and we're doing that because it's in the news today. I want to take you. I'm going to bring up a newspaper or a news story from just yesterday, actually. And here it is, according and with thanks to the Salem Reporter. Governor Kate Brown commutes 17 death sentences, ending death row. And if you follow this story, you know that this is actually, I think it's actually a somewhat significant event in Oregon public policy. You can see the screen there. I'll take it down now, but here's a little background. If you aren't familiar with this issue and how it's been part of Oregon life, especially for the last 10 or 15 years or so. Back in 2011, then Governor John Kitzhaber, he issued a moratorium on the death penalty. And he did that because there was an inmate by the name of Gary Haugen, and he was set to be executed. He actually was effectively requesting it. He gave up his right to appeals, and he wanted the death penalty to be applied to him. Governor Kitzhaber at the time didn't want to do that, and so what he did is he effectively stopped all death penalties until death sentences until he had a chance to review, and the goal was there to what he actually said. He said, "My hope and my intention in taking this action today is to bring about a long due reevaluation of our current policy and our current system of capital punishment." So his action was really meant as a temporary action. It was meant really to allow time for public review and possibly, and I think his intent was to have legislation that would effectively end the death penalty here in Oregon. Well, that didn't happen, at least not legislatively. There have been no laws that have repealed the death penalty here in Oregon. Oregon's had the death penalty for, 30 or 40 years or so. I think in that time they have executed, I think, only 2 individuals. I could be mistaken on that, but I think it's only 2 individuals. And then, of course, since 2011, that ended. Supposed to be a temporary suspension of that, but that temporary suspension, that moratorium, has continued into under the leadership of now current Governor Kate Brown. And Kate Brown, my understanding is that she did some review, she did some analysis, but again, no legislation was passed that repealed the death penalty. There was nothing that changed the law. In 2019, Kate Brown issued an executive order that limited the scope of the death penalty. In other words, it changed the sorts of crimes that would be eligible for the death penalty. It made it really narrowed the focus so that only the most extreme kinds of crimes that you can think of, terrorism that kills more than 2 individuals, I think, and murder of a police officer or public safety officer would have counted. Those sorts of things. Those were still eligible, but all other crimes then were no longer eligible for death penalty. That was in 2019. Then in 2021, there were some challenges that were brought to the Supreme Court that essentially what it did was that for those who'd been sentenced under the old version of the law, that their appeals were brought to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court actually then said, well, if the new law says that you're not eligible for the death penalty, then you're still no longer, then now, even if you were eligible for the death penalty under previous law, now you're no longer eligible for the death penalty. So it effectively repealed the death penalty for all but 17 individuals who are on Oregon's death row. The 2021 law essentially made the 2021 ruling made the law of 2019 retroactive, and so you were left with 17 inmates now on death row who fit the 2021 criteria. So that's where we were up until today. Now, what Kate Brown did yesterday, she repealed she didn't repeal. She commuted the sentences of all of those remaining 17 inmates. She essentially changed their sentence to life without the opportunity for parole. One of the things that she said when she did this is that she said it is an irreversible punishment that does not allow for correction, is wasteful of taxpayer dollars, and does not make communities safer, and cannot and never has been administered fairly and equitably. Now, I want to challenge a couple of the assumptions there, and then I want to give my own sort of analysis from a biblical standpoint. What sense do we make of the death penalty? First off, she makes the case that it is an irreversible punishment that does not allow for correction. Now, let's suppose that is true for just a moment. Let's and because I think arguably it is, although the length of time that people remain on death row is so long that I think it does allow for correction, although it doesn't allow for an opportunity to get out and live a free life, but it does allow for a person to reform and to become a different person. But let's suppose, for the sake of argument for a moment, let's assume that her premise is correct there, that it does not allow for correction. The assumption that's baked into that is that the justice system is always meant to be restorative. That is, it's always meant to lead towards correction and to allow for that. And I think there's absolutely a place for that. The importance of restorative justice and even the opportunity for people to learn from their mistakes and to correct their mistakes, I think is really, really important. But I also think that there are cases where the judicial system is not meant to rehabilitate. I'm not sure that's an absolute assumption that we have to hold to, that every case in the judicial system is about rehabilitation. I do think that sometimes the purpose is purely penal, that a debt has been incurred to society such that the penalty for that is to be, I think you can now come back to this in a minute, but you could make the case that the penalty then is death, and that must be paid, and it's not about rehabilitation any longer. That's the first thing. The second thing I want to challenge is that what she says is that it cannot and never has been administered fairly and equitably. I'm not sure that that's actually accurate. I'm not sure that it's fair to assume, first of all, that a punishment cannot and never has been fairly and equitably administered. I'm not. She's saying that the death penalty, it's impossible for it to be done in a way that's equitable and fair, that doesn't, for example, single out or unfavorably target people of, say, a racial background or a socioeconomic background. In other words, she's assuming that the death penalty cannot be applied in cases, or I shouldn't say it can be applied, but if you have a case where a person of a lower socioeconomic status is accused, she's saying that it's impossible for them then to be fairly tried and for justice to be done under the current system. I'm not sure that that's true. In other words, I think it could, in theory, be done where the death penalty is administered in a way that's fairly and equitably. So I would challenge some of those assumptions, and but my bigger concern here with this action is sort of the means by which this came about, and which is to say, I think the proper procedure here would have been to have done this through the state legislature. I believe that a decision as consequential and as significant as the death penalty is something that should be decided at the very least by elected officials, not by this kind of use of executive power. In this case, now I realize that the state constitution grants the powers of clemency to the governor, but this seems to me to be really using those powers to do an end run around what should be the proper procedure, which is you gather the legislature, you propose a bill, and you debate the bill, and you gain public input and feedback and so on. And so I think, because if you go back to then Governor Kitzhaber's goal, that was his purpose in this. He said this should be reviewed and we should revisit this and reevaluate. And I think, at the time he had the right to do that. I think to impose a moratorium, although I had some concerns back then when that was done. But at the very least, the legislative process should have played out there. I am uncomfortable when leaders use their executive powers to advance their political agenda in this way. Now, that said, what does the Bible say? My underlying question here is, what does the Bible really say about the death penalty? And what can we look at for guidance when it comes to the death penalty? Does the Bible require it? Does it mandate it? Does it permit it? Does it forbid it? You have to deal with a number of different ideas, and one of them, we'll start with one of them, which is the commandment against murder. Thou shalt not murder. On the face of it, it would seem to be that this actually doesn't really apply, because the command "thou shalt not murder" does not speak to the sort of let's call it this. It does not speak to this to a case in which a person is paying the death penalty, paying for a crime with the death penalty. And at least we can know that because there are places in the Old Testament, for example, where the death penalty is commanded. And so it would be incompatible to say that the Bible forbids, under the commandment of murder, the Bible also forbids killing or execution as a punishment. Those two ideas, that wouldn't be compatible. Murder applies to the taking of a life in an act of violence against another person. It includes, lashing out, and it does not refer to a state-sponsored execution. Now, that said, I think there are still there's underlying concerns here. The command about murder has to do with respecting the image of God in another human being, and so I think that does apply here. In other words, whenever we think about taking the life of another individual, even if it is for a valid reason, which I'll come to in just a minute, we ought to be so wary about that. We ought to be so careful, because we are not just, no matter how heinous a person's crime may have been, no matter what they may have committed, however atrocious it might have been, we still must remember that individual does bear the image of God. And so we should never be cavalier. We should never be reckless in even speaking of or carrying out the death penalty. Now, so that's kind of some broad picture ideas that relate to death penalty, but more to the point is, I think probably the more relevant passage is Romans chapter 13. I'll bring it up on the screen here. And in Romans chapter 13, the Apostle Paul is dealing with the question of authority and our relationship as Christians to the authority. And one of the things that Paul points out here, he actually says that the government is armed with the sword. So be afraid, for he that is the government does not bear the sword in vain. Now, that right there is an admission or recognition that the government does have the authority of the sword, which is to say that the government is entrusted with it, and it is entrusted with the ability to protect and to preserve life, but also to take life under certain circumstances or conditions. Now, here's where I think we get into a really, really important question, and that is the question of does this mean that the death penalty is required? Should Christians insist on their governments carrying out the death penalty? And I think the answer here is no. I think the Bible, on the one hand, takes seriously the gravity and the weight and the significance of sin. The Bible, you hear God's heart for justice, you see God's hatred for evil and injustice and violence, and you see his commitment to punishing it. And I think so I think that's part of it. But when it talks about the government being armed with the sword, I don't think that necessarily mandates or stipulates that somehow Christians should expect or require or demand that their governments do this. I think there's room for, I think the bigger principle here has more to do with what is the government permitted to do and what may be acceptable for governments to do. And I think there are ways that you can enforce the rule of law. You can actually protect and preserve life in society without carrying out the death penalty. So I think you can be a conscientious Christian, a Christian shaped by biblical conscience, and not insist on the death penalty. In fact, you can be opposed to the death penalty and still hold to the truth of what Romans 13 is talking about. In fact, I think there are reasons to be concerned and even to even to abolish the death penalty, at least in our at least under most cases, most conditions. I think a couple of those reasons would be, number one, a very practical reason is the cost. It is far, far, far more expensive to try and then imprison an individual on death row, far more expensive than it is to simply try a case that would lead to imprisonment for life without parole and then to carry out that sentence. I think the cost there is the cost for a capital crime is so great, and because of all the appeals, and because usually the state ends up bearing those costs. I think it's so prohibitive that I think it's not necessarily a good or wise punishment. I'm not sure about the deterrent effect of capital punishment. I've seen different things on that. I've seen some that say it really does not have a deterrent effect at all. In other words, if those people who commit the sorts of crimes that lead to the death penalty are not usually going to pause and think, well, if we do this, it might lead us to be put to death. They usually are bent on committing their crimes anyways, or their crimes that are committed in sort of the heat of the moment, and so I'm not sure that it has a real deterrent effect. And then finally, I think that the possibility of error is actually so significant, and there have been actually quite a number of cases that especially on the federal throughout the country, where an individual is shown to be, they're exonerated because of DNA evidence, or key witness retracts their statement or something of that sort. And if that's the case, then I think because there is that possibility for error, and because we should never go lightly into something like the death penalty, I would think that those to me are reasons to really be very, very cautious about wanting it and instituting it in society. I think it may be better to think of other deterrents, life without parole sorts of things. So, but again, I think this is one of these issues where Christians can disagree. I think Christians can make the case that the Bible permits capital punishment, but I think it also, a conscientious Christian can say, well, even if the Bible permits it, it's not the best and most effective way to handle crime. So, hey, speaking of the death penalty, we've kind of taken a look at why this is in the news lately, and some of the background to it, and we've kind of maybe critiqued a little bit of the current legislatures or the current governor's approach and biblical perspective. Thanks for joining me, and as always, we'll hope to see you next time on the next episode of Speaking Of.